Hello again, my friends. So, in the previous lecture, we learned all about how to mutate variables, dynamic typing, as well as a couple of other developmental tools we can use. So, in this video, that means we're going to learn about a couple of basic JavaScript operators. Remember, I kind of postponed them to later? Well, now is later, or later has now become now. Anyway, here I have already created the title for this lecture, and I've also commented out the code that we worked on before. So as you can see, I've cleared my console. Now, as for the operators, they can be, for example, just simple math operators that you probably, hopefully, already know, like plus and minus and times. But besides those, in JavaScript, we have a couple of other operators that I want to show you now. So just simply, operators are functions that are written in a special way in JavaScript. So we're going to learn exactly what these functions are and then why we need them. And again, we'll dive into the why a little bit later. But let's right now look at some of the math operators and how we use them in JavaScript. So right now, let's calculate how far Alex is from school. Now, it should be very simple. So first of all, let's name this variable as distance Alex to define the distance between Alex and school. And I'll say var and distance Alex. Now let's suppose that the distance between Alex's house and his school is 20 kilometers. And we'll imagine Alex has walked 20 kilometers. So to find how far Alex is from school, we need to say 20 minus 12. And then later on to see the result, I'm just going to the console and we'll just console log this variable. So I'll just say console.log, and inside of it, I'll say distance Alex. So when we go to our browser, we see 8 in our console. So this here, the minus, is the math operator in JavaScript. And let's now do the same, let's say, for someone else, like John's friend. Let's say he's called Sam. So let's just imagine Sam has walked 7 kilometers. So we'll define a variable and say distance Sam. And now to find how far Sam is from the school, I'll say 20 minus 7. Now if I console log this to variable, console log distance Sam. So here in the browser, we will see 13. All right, so Sam's distance to school is 13 kilometers. So you see then that we're starting to repeat some of the same values. For example, 20 here. So we're using it multiple times. So that means that we can declare it as a separate variable. So why don't we do that? That's what variables are for anyway, right? So we can say var total distance is 20. So now instead of having to reuse this 20 here, we can now write total distance in these two places. Okay, so when we look at the result, we're going to see the exact same number because we haven't changed any of the data. We just changed how we got there. Now, if we want to change the total distance, then we wouldn't have to change it here in these two places like we did before. And before, if we wanted to change the distance, we would have to change it both here and here. And that's something that you do want to, well, I would say always want to avoid when you're programming. So we've defined this total distance in one place, and then we've used it in these two places here. All right, so that makes sense. So in fact, let's also declare all of these variables here in the same line, just like I showed you before. So here at the top, I'll write var and total distance, then distance Alex and distance Sam. So then we move these two vars from here. So this just looks a bit cleaner, a little bit better. It's a lot more understandable, right? Now, of course, nothing's changed at the moment. When we look at our console again, we see the same result. All right, so that's just the minus operator here. Of course, we can do all kinds of math here. For example, we can multiply. Now, to see the result directly in our console, I'm going to write console.log, and inside of it, I'll say distance Sam times 2. Then when we go to the browser here, we'll see 26. Okay, so back in our code editor again. Here we made multiplication. And we can, of course, divide as well. So let's divide this distance Sam by 2 here. All right. Logging it all to the console. And now we can see that this is 13 divided by 2. All right, so we've ended up with a decimal number here. All right, so that's cool. So these are the math operators. So why don't we add a comment here saying that? All right, so now I'm going to show you some logical operators, as if math isn't logical. All right, so we'll write it down here as logical operators for our comment. So now let's say that we want to compare the distance of Alex between home and school. So to do that, we'll declare different variables. I'll say var distance to school and distance to home. And now we want to compare these two variables. So first let's give some values to these variables. So I can say distance to home and 14. And distance to school, 6. All right, so now let's say I want to compare these values. So for that, we can use a logical operator. So I'll say distance to home is less than distance to school. Now let's create a new variable here and store the results in this variable. So I'll say var is closer and equals. At the moment, distance to home is 14, and distance to school is 6. So it'll say here is 14 is less than 6. Is that true? Of course it isn't. So this is going to be false. So do you see what I'm getting at here is, I mean that my is closer variable is going to be Boolean. All right, so let's console log this variable. I'll say console.log and is closer. Cool, so now let's take a closer look at what happens now. So we see that our result is this Boolean and it's false. All right. So basically here we have asked the question, is distance to home less than distance to school? And the result of that is false. You follow? Okay. And so our is closer variable here turns out to be false. Okay. So now, what if it was the other way around? If we asked distance to home is greater than distance to school. Well, it should be the other way around. So let's see, and yeah, there you go. Indeed, it is now true. All right. So now we have a way of basically creating a Boolean variable using just one of the logical operators that I just showed you. Now, there are many more that we can explore a little bit later on when you're more familiar and more comfortable with this. Practice around in case you are a little bit shaky. But, math operators are pretty straightforward. These logical operators, although they may seem straightforward, they are also very important. And I want you to get comfortable with them because we are going to be using them throughout the course. So go back and review if you need to. Otherwise, we're going to continue in the next section. All right? See you there.